Welcome to Impact Pasadena. I'm Hoyt Hillsman, and I'm delighted to welcome today Andy Wilson, our City Council member from District 7 in Pasadena. And Andy's a fascinating guy. He's an entrepreneur, he's an innovator, he's been involved in high technology for years, longtime resident of Pasadena, 20 years in Pasadena. And he served in the public arena a lot on things from the Design Commission to the Planning Commission, and he's made a contribution, a great contribution, I'd say, to our city, even before he stepped up into the political arena. So Andy, welcome, and we're so delighted to have you.
Thanks, Hoyt. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me to your show.
Well, you know, you were appointed in 2015 to the City Council, and then you were elected again, or actually for the first time in 2017.
Right.
So your term is for 4 years, I believe, depending on how the election calendar works out.
Right.
But I really wanted to start a little bit, to go back a little bit and start, I know you've told the story before of how you came to Pasadena. You're a Pasadenan by choice,
right,
rather than native Pasadena.
Right.
How did you settle on Pasadena, you and your wife?
Yeah. So as a kid, we moved a lot around quite a bit, including overseas assignments.
Parents in the military, was that?
My dad worked in the oil business.
Oh, okay.
I have to be careful how I say that.
Yeah.
And the good news is it gave me a real perspective. Before we came to Pasadena, I had lived in 12 different cities.
Right.
Many of them being international, and came from Chicago most recently. And I had an extraordinary opportunity. Most of us kind of live where we need to live because if there's a job opportunity
Sure.
or something. And I fortunately met my wonderful wife Liz in Chicago. It was a little cold for me in Chicago.
Yeah.
And no insult to the Midwesterners, but it was a little Midwestern for me, having lived in
Right.
international cities.
Sure.
Love the architecture, though, in Chicago.
Yeah.
And I had an opportunity to start a company for a large Fortune 500 that was based in Chicago.
Right.
And they said, Andy, you can set up your business, your operation for us anywhere in the Western U.S.
Wow.
And so that gives you, like, choose where you want to go.
Yeah.
And I was looking for something that obviously had great weather, neighborhoods. I love architecture, and you'll hear that theme over and over again. I love epic institutions, and I think we have plenty of those here. And
Sure.
the reality came down between Pasadena and Palo Alto.
Okay.
And my wife's family's from Palo Alto, and my mother-in-law still lives there, so needless to say, we ended up in Pasadena. It's a safe distance.
Yeah, right.
And it's been a home run ever since. I mean, it was a home run.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. And since then, I've recruited my brothers now in Pasadena,
Nice.
and my sister's here in Pasadena, and my parents have a home in Pasadena.
Oh, great.
So as somebody who grew up as kind of a nomad,
Well,
Pasadena's home. We're home. This
I
is
was
our
going
home.
to say, I was an Army brat, and I had a similar experience moving from place to
Yeah.
place and feeling kind of rootless.
Right.
And then for me, sort of a similar story, ending up in Pasadena and feeling like you finally found a home.
And I say we won the lottery too. It's not only a home, but and I think that it kind of ties in probably to your next question is when you've been searching for a place to call home and you feel like you found it, your relationship with that place is very different than if you're just a transient.
Yeah.
And we're like, hey, we're going to be here forever. And I tell my wife we're going to run our mortgage out and we're going to have a retirement house here and my kids are going to raise their families. So when you take that really long-term view, selfishly speaking, the fruits of your labor, which could be, take decades to realize, you're going to be here to see those. And so it's a very different mindset.
Well, it is too, and I guess for you, as it was for me, a home and community was sort of an abstraction because it's always a different place.
Right.
But when you really have that connection, it's profound.
It's magical, and my kids, I don't know if they fully appreciate because they've lived in the same house in the same street.
Yeah.
And so that sense of kind of yearning doesn't exist. I feel certainly content that they're living an extraordinary life, though they may not fully appreciate it.
Yeah. So. Innovation, entrepreneurship, technology. Right. I know you went to Dartmouth undergrad, and then you went to get an MBA at Harvard.
Right.
So what was it about technology and entrepreneurship that grabbed you?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, at my heart, I'm an engineer, and not that I ever practiced, but in me is this desire to build things. I kind of feel that's engineering, but I was always building blocks as a kid.
Yeah.
So that was kind of programmed in me. And then when I was in Chicago, my job there, and I know you're kind of a media guy, was with a big printing company called R. Donnelley & Sons. And my first job was to run a lot of printing plants, and this is in the mid-90s. And you can imagine what was happening with print and technology and digital data in the mid-90s. So I was there because I liked producing stuff, and printing was something we produced, and I loved media. But it was the technology piece that kind of ended up in my lap, because the people who'd been there for a long time kind of only knew how to do it the old way.
Yeah.
And I was new to that industry, so it really put me kind of in this technology innovation track. And frankly, I've never gotten off of it. So that technology piece has been a very dominant theme. I think the second piece is problem solving. And I've started a bunch of companies. I had a fortunate experience to work at Idea Lab, but we probably all know that here in Pasadena, where Bill Gross and his company have created 150 startup companies. And a great company always begins with a problem that people need to solve. So and that's been in my DNA, looking at problems facing citizens, and I think about that in our city council work. I think about that in not-for-profit work, and we certainly can talk about Innovate Pasadena for a bit. And so this kind of innovation, problem solving with a very strong community aspect, because I really yearn for that, has kind of been the hub of my life.
Right.
And as I said, giving back has always been an ethos that I picked up. My mother was a very active volunteer.
Yeah.
And I was never quite sure why, but then for me, volunteerism was community building and giving back to your community. So I've been in pretty much most of the commissions and have a 20-year service record in Pasadena.
Well, it's interesting. Technology, I think, actually, in addition to being part of innovation, it also pushes innovation, I think. And I'm seeing this in the public sector more and more, that as technology comes along, people think about the problem-solving aspect of this. And hey, we don't necessarily need to do it the old way, because we have this technology that's pushing us to innovate. So on innovation, tell me about Innovate Pasadena.
Right. So one of the things that I've observed that's extraordinary about Pasadena is it kind of fights the LA myth, in the sense that you can have an incredibly enriched life in Pasadena without having to be a kind of a victim of your car every day. And there are not a lot of places that are kind of so enriched as Pasadena and kind of self-contained. So institutions and housing stock and Playhouse and museums, and the job stock to me was always very important as well. And as a high-tech person, when I was working with Idea Lab and Overture Services and Yahoo, 15 years ago, Pasadena really was ground zero for kind of internet innovation. Then I ran a venture capital fund with some friends, which is much more kind of regional. And I came back 5-6 years ago to build a small technology company in Pasadena. And what I found out is that kind of innovation, vibrancy that I'd experienced when I was first at Idea Lab, it kind of moved to the west side, the Silicon Beach movement. And so if you wanted to be an innovator and participate in an innovation community, you were kind of subject to that horrible commute to head out to Santa Monica. And by the way, they have a great community there. It's just not where I choose to live, and that distance has become longer over time. And I had realized, having built innovation companies, that the community you're involved in that surrounds you is really an enabler. Just like, why is there a Hollywood not, why isn't there media everywhere? It tends to be concentrated. And I saw that community that I had participated in previously had kind of lost some of its mojo. And so I started talking to the president of Caltech and Art Center and people who are running technology companies. And what you realize is that the building blocks were still here, but the connectivity and kind of the branding and the vibrancy, the external aspects of that community were missing. And the mission of Innovate Pasadena is kind of to re-engage those building blocks, create an innovation hub, community connectivity, so that the companies that are here can benefit from that peer relationship.
So is it a networking organization, or is it a funding organization, or is it both?
Definitely not funding.
Not funding, right.
And it's community building. It's community building. And the thesis, of course, is when you're especially building startups, you have to kind of beg, borrow, and steal. And if you know who's in your community, you know who the experts are. And what we found is in Pasadena and in our innovation economy here tends to be more focused around hard sciences. versus kind of social media entertainment on the west side. And my observation is kind of the harder the science and the more nerdy the person is, the less likely they are to network and get to know other people outside of their own silo.
Yeah.
And so Innovate Pasadena is really a networking organization that uses education as the hook, because if I tell a PhD electrical engineering that we're going to have a networking event, they're like, they don't like it. They're like, I'd rather be coding. I really don't like hanging out with other people, perhaps.
Yeah.
But if we use education, so hey, we're going to talk about big data and analytics or data visualization or artificial intelligence, they come out to these meetups.
I got it.
And then the networking just happens.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a bait and switch.
Well, that's great. I speaking of education, I'm a big interest in that, and I noticed that you're advisor to STEAM Coders.
Yeah.
Talk about STEAM Coders. Great name.
Yeah. So just to close that Innovate Pasadena for a second. So that group so far, it's a volunteer-based. I've been a volunteer since day one and partnered with a guy named Mike Giradella. It's done close to 500 educational events and connected 50,000 people in this part of Los Angeles. And I'll tell you, and I'm super proud of the work in the sense that it has helped companies succeed. It has helped people get jobs in their own backyard. And otherwise, they were faced with commuting to Santa Monica or Orange County. So in terms of affecting quality of life, having jobs for people who live in Pasadena so they can take Metro bike share rather than being jammed in a car for an hour and a half, I think is extraordinarily beneficial. So when I think about that community building piece, yes, it's about entrepreneurship and job creation. It's also about quality of life for the citizens. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to make sure that people are clear where all this works and how it fits together in terms of how I see Pasadena continuing to prove itself. And STEAM Coders is certainly related, right? It's about introducing mostly underprivileged youth to the opportunities and getting them exposed to kind of coding and robotics. And Raymond Ely, who's the executive director of that organization, by the way, he would be a great guest for you. Extraordinary guy. He started STEAM Coders a few years ago, and I think the last metric he had kind of introduced something like 1,500 inner city youth to this kind of the concept of technology in high school. And the goal is not to make these people Google engineers. I hope some of them become Google engineers, but introduce them to the world of the possible. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think that in my PCC functions, we have something called workforce development, and that's aimed at mid-skill jobs. You don't necessarily need even a college degree to do certain kinds of jobs in high technology, entertainment, manufacturing, and there's a big push statewide and nationwide actually to do that. It's really important, and it'd be great.
And you got to plant the seed early, right?
Oh yeah, and it's about networking, and it's about getting internships and all these things that are way that people go.
Well, one thing I'd just add on that too is having participated with Raymond in some of his sessions. What's great about being a volunteer. It's an incredible way to learn and kind of expand your own horizon. Right. And their audience base is very much, I think, it's African American and Latino primarily. And the biggest barrier, and you probably realize this, but eye-opening to me, is the parents. Yeah. And when he was doing some sessions, and the parents really were looking for opportunities for their kids. So I laud them for that. But and it sounds super stereotypical, but a lot of it was, hey, if you're a male, you were going to be a professional athlete. If you're a female, you were going to be a singer, and that's like winning the lottery.
Absolutely.
And they spend all their time thinking about that rather than saying, well, if you can get basic technical skills, you can have a kind of really nice middle class quality of life rather than shooting for the stars when most people don't make it. Right. So getting the parents to think about technical education.
Absolutely, and affordability issues. A lot of kids are working 30 hours to try to do it, but you can get a two-year AA degree and do a lot of great stuff with it.
Absolutely.
I got a lot of other things I want to talk to you about.
Yeah, ready to move on. Let's keep going.
Yeah. So talking about expanding horizons, you put your toe in the not just your toe, your whole heart and soul, I think, into the political arena.
I think the bruises are mostly healing.
Yeah, they are. You look like you survived, but I know it's a struggle. But good for you, and I think we might want to talk about. I do want to talk to you about some of the issues that have come up since you've been on the city council, and we can just let's start with a couple of issues that you see as the most important facing the city of Pasadena, not just citywide, not just district.
Right. I mean. clearly, and it's not a sexy topic, but the finances of the city.
Yeah.
With the pension obligations that were made to our municipal employees literally 15, 20 years ago. Of course, if you go back then, it was bull market and everyone said, hey, we're flush with cash. And at the time, those policymakers wanted to share some of that success with the employee population, and I think the pension plans got committed to that simply over a period of time or just haven't been funded sufficiently. And we're stuck with those obligations, and some cities have been forced to go bankrupt, and every time they don't kind of meet that performance target, they give us a bigger bill. Yeah. I'm happy to say I just saw, and you probably saw this, Hoyt, a couple of weeks ago, CalPERS reported their, I think it was the last 12-month kind of earnings. And the retirement plans are built off, I think, around 7 or 7.25% return, and they frankly returned 11%, as opposed to last year was 1%. Yeah. So, when they miss it, the bill goes up, and when they exceed, I'm not sure they're going to drop the bill down because we're underfunded. But yeah. That's kind of what's going on, and our obligation here from the city, literally in the next, I think it's around $40 million across all our departments, is on its way in the next 5 or 10 years to coming close to double that. Clearly, if the market outperforms, then it's better, but just looking at where we are today, so there's a big unfunded liability.
So solutions, I know, are cutting back on the budget, layoffs. Yeah. There's also some court cases running around here in terms of this, but what's your prediction and forecast on it?
So first of all, what I have come to realize is, having worked in the city, and no organization is perfect, but we do have a lot of talented people, and being kind of in city staff is not always an easy job and sometimes a bit thankless. So we want to have high quality people, and I think we need to properly pay them and compensate them. And the retirement benefits are an important part of that. So we can't ruin that, but also we got to pay the bills. Yeah. And as you mentioned, some court cases coming along that may allow us a little latitude, because right now it's been like you made this exact commitment, and there's not been a lot of flexibility. So I think if we get some flexibility, I think we need to look at how we can make some refinements to still make sure we're properly compensating people, but also not having to cut back in services. Mm-hmm. That hasn't been resolved yet, but I'm watching that closely. We've also in the heyday, as you know, employees, at least in the city of Pasadena, got to a point where they weren't contributing, and now most of our employees are actually, they're all contributing. Somewhere between 7 and 9%, and we're now taking the public safety folks who tend to have the most expensive cost to 11 or 12%. Right. So kind of more of that cost sharing. And I've come to the private sector where heck, if you put it all in and maybe your employer matches, so we're not used to these models where where they have these fixed benefit plans. Yeah. But in the meantime, as we're working these things out, it does put a lot of pressure on the budget. And I think the primary service we provide, as you're probably aware, is public safety. Mm-hmm. More than 60% of our general fund goes to fire and police, and that's the most critical service we provide. And with the aging of our population, most of those calls for fire are medical, and we want to make sure if you have a heart attack, someone shows up on time. So we have to be careful about not impacting our ability to, in that case, mm-hmm. save lives. Clearly, we have a diverse community, and the police are busy at certain times, and some would argue that maybe we're overstaffed, understaffed, but I think it's important that we have a high quality, properly staffed police organization. So in that 60% of your budget, there isn't a lot, it's the other 40%, and we need libraries, and need parks. So I think what the city has done is looked at kind of privatizing some stuff we probably shouldn't have been in. Some clinics we spun out, and frankly, they're doing better without our control. Focusing on the core services, mm-hmm. And doing what we do well, right? The other thing, and I've kind of challenged our city manager on this, is having been in a legislative position now for the last 2 years plus, I can tell you we're constantly adding new policies and procedures, and rarely do we go back and say, that thing we did 12 years ago, is it still relevant? And we may still have someone running around doing it.
What about on the other side of the coin, the economic development and increasing revenues, right. and stuff?
So I'll call it what I just talked about is efficient government.
Yeah.
Right? So now how do you grow the revenue side? The biggest driver for us, of course, is property taxes. And it does help when, we've been very fortunate to have our property prices, recover quite handily. When development occurs, it takes kind of a low use property and makes it high use, and that helps as well. Transit-oriented tax, hotel tax, and we just re-engineered some of the revenue sharing with the convention center, so I think that's accretive to how things work. I don't think unfortunately, I don't think the narrative around sales taxes is positive.
In what way?
So think about big box retailers.
Right.
Look at what's happening to stores like Macy's and Sears, and for us, the Avon Distribution Center was a big revenue generator for us, and that is now exiting. So e-commerce is here to stay, and guilty as charged. I'm a big Amazon user, and
sure.
So I think we'll always have retail, but we're seeing things like restaurants and services where it's hard to have those come from Amazon. But traditional, more commodity retail products are under pressure, and we kind of always knew that was going to happen. The question is when.
Yeah.
And I was talking to the city manager, and I asked imagine if you have a big box, let's say on Foothill, and that generates a certain amount of sales tax. Imagine if now that's residential. Now it creates property tax, so the driver there is different. And the good news is when you look at that substitution effect for land, because that's what's the commodity here, they are relatively equivalent, right? But what that tells you is as retail goes away, I guess the good news is we're going to see residential capacity in some of those areas. And in particular, I look at the Sierra Madre line at Foothill. There's 3 or 4 projects over there around transit, and anyone who knows me knows I'm a big mass transit traffic fighter, and having people concentrated around mass transit makes total sense.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting there, which is certainly unusual for Pasadena, is that we have a bunch of land stock coming online within a certain kind of time frame, so we can think about how that could build as a neighborhood, right? In my district, there's a piece here, there's a piece there. We're kind of doing infill. But around where Big Box has been located, there's really an opportunity to create new neighborhoods and kind of new urban nodes and community centers.
Already happening kind of thing.
Yeah, it's already happening, and we're not used to having that. We've had no opportunities.
Yeah.
So with every change, and this is kind of the innovator, doesn't it suck that these stores are going away?
Yeah.
You got to look for the opportunity.
Right.
You got to look for the opopportunity. And
well, I know in your recent campaign, development was a big issue, and it wasn't so much actually a district level. It's a city issue. It's a citywide issue, and I know we're going to go into in the next segment. We're going to probably slop over into that on development. Sure. But I know you have some strong views on it, and it's a contentious issue. Progress always. I know it's related to ancillary issues like traffic, but maybe if you could give us the broad brush on development, we'll get into it a little bit more deeply in a few minutes.
So, as you're certainly very aware, we went through a 6-year, $6 million update of our general plan. And thousands of people participated in that. And I think the people who haven't followed that narrative, the conclusions were pretty strong, is that about 2/3 of our land mass is protected and will continue to be protected as single-family residential. Right? No changes to your neighborhood, my neighborhood. Right. The real question is what's happening in the central district, like the urban core up the middle. In that general plan, there were some adjustments down in terms of kind of office use. And basically said we don't want to accelerate residential.
Well, and just to clarify, when you say down the middle, you're actually talking about north and south of the freeway.
Yeah, think about Colorado, essentially east to west.
And a little bit north
Sierra
and south.
Madre and Foothill.
Okay.
And the central district, kind of the specific plan area goes down to Fair Oaks a little bit.
Yeah.
There's some fingers, but it's basically kind of what you think is kind of the urban part, the non-residential part.
Got it.
And we have properties that are underutilized, parking lots, or maybe they're light industrial.
Right.
And so concentrating any population growth in those areas, because in your neighborhood, if you can take down a house, and many of them protected, you can't.
Yeah.
You only can take one for one, so there's no growth. But we know there is a housing crisis. That's why housing has gotten so expensive. No one can afford to live here.
Yeah.
A shortage in that, and Pasadena, because we're a built-out city, we're growing at about a quarter of the rate of the county of LA, because we have no space. But we do have kind of unrealized development potential in parts of that kind of central district. So point being is protecting the neighborhoods, concentrating where there's mass transit, also where you have mixed use, where not only do you have mass transit, but I could actually be in multifamily, maybe do metro bike share to get from point A to point B, walk to the store or restaurant. So if we're going to have any new population, what is a way to do it where it protects those things that are sacred in our city and also creates the least impacts in terms of mobility, right? And that is kind of the theme around the update to our general plan. So I support that. I do think there's a secondary part of that is once you have this general plan, you kind of write these specific plans that talk about how they actually get executed really at the zoning level, kind of sub area by sub area.
Well, it's, as you said, it's the devil in the details, and we're going to get into that in the next segment.
Okay, perfect.
You've laid out the broad theme and the broad strokes, but we're going to talk some more about it.
I can't wait.
In the weeds. Thank you, Andy.
It's been fun.
I will see you in a few minutes. Thanks for staying.
My pleasure. This program was produced by Pasadena Media for the Arroyo Channel.